Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. The first time I'm in Malta, actually, which is, given my advanced age, is actually almost embarrassing that I haven't been here before. But there are lots of people who come here who are more distinguished than me, you know, from St. Paul to Caravaggio and other people, whom I will not be noticing tonight. Right, I hope, is this too loud or it's all good? Okay, good. I can even hear down in the background, you can hear me. So I'm here to talk about a book that has been sort of a long time in the making, really. And the book is here. It's called The Political Brain as opposed to The Democratic Brain. And it's a very short book. And if I say it took me about 30 years to write, you think that I'm working rather slowly, which I might be. So I will start sort of by a little bit of biographical introduction. So as was said before, I feel I've been doing rather too many different things in my life. Or maybe that just comes with age, when you've been around doing different things. But way back in the late 1980s, some of you remember those days, others won't. You might not have been born by the time, some of you, others might. Back in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, I started my career out studying brain science, which I have to say was not always as exciting as it sounds. And I realized I was much more interested in politics, but I still had a fascination for this brain stuff. So I thought after I'd done my first degree that I would shift into political science, which was, by and large, a political science and philosophy, which is sort of like the sort of dessert options where you can sort of talk about things in the pub as well. You don't have to know a lot of stuff. So all the brain stuff I kind of left behind because I thought, well, there's no way you can really, and in those days there wasn't any way in which you could actually understand politics and philosophy by using brain scans. But I always people were sort of saying, well, and a lot of people when I shifted over to politics and philosophy, there were people in my course who said, well, but you weren't originally a philosopher, you weren't originally a political scientist, you were a brain scientist. And they sort of used to tease me and say, so you're going to put Aristotle and Plato in the brain scanner, are you? And I say, well, in due course I will, which is rather difficult because they died quite a long time ago, but metaphorically speaking. So in a way, this book that I have written is Plato or Aristotle or Cicero or whoever you want to have in the brain scanner. Now, so that's sort of like a little bit of biographical background, but I think it was Aristotle. You've heard of Aristotle, I'm sure most of you. A Macedonian guy. Somebody nodding there. I'm very impressed, actually. Not all my students say that. Anyway, so Aristotle once said that in order to give a speech, you have to have three things. You have to have credibility, which I don't know if I have. You have to have a rational argument, which will be seen. And then you have to speak with passion and pathos. And again, that's up to you, crowd. I'll see if you go to sleep. And if any of you go to sleep, then I have not hit the pathos button as well. Anyway, so we should get started. So this is the democratic brain, and I will be talking about both body, soul, and politics. Again, we're covering quite a lot of ground here. Right, so here is my book, and I'll be walking up and down, because that's what I do when I have in my day job. I know you can't see me if I do that, so that's not so helpful. Right, so what I will argue is that we have politics on our mind. A lot of people talk about politics all the time. By the way, the average American talks about politics only 12 minutes a year. And I was about to say that kind of shows. I hope there are no Americans in here that would be offended by that. Anyway, I just came back from Texas, and they were sort of like, are you sure about that? And they have that sort of accent. Anyway, I can't even do the American accent. Anyway, so a lot of people have politics on the mind and politics are on our brain. And I kind of wanted to go back and understand how those thoughts on politics can be seen in our brain and actually how it can make better politics. So all this brain stuff is not just about me being a materialistic philosopher, or a materialist philosopher, or non-dualism and all these other sort of philosophical terms. It's also to understand how we are, and this is my strapline, this is my goal, is to say we are actually hardwired, we are evolutionarily programmed to think rationally, to come up with rational solutions, and all this politics of hate, sorry if I'm being very political here, all this politics of hate, actually I don't think that's being political, I don't think we like the politics of hate, I don't think we like division, and what I'm endeavouring to show tonight, whether I succeed or not we don't know, is that the philosophy, the political philosophy through the ages will merge with neuroscience, and we're basically all back together again. So, in other words, the philosophical theories of Plato, Aristotle, Spinoza, and Hannah Arendt, I am curiously aware that there aren't enough female philosophers that I mention here, and I'm sorry about that. I'm actually working on another book called 19 Nerds and the Chain-Smoking Woman, Hannah Arendt being the chain-smoking woman, and the 19 nerds being all male, but that's for another day. So what I'll basically say is that some of the theories of these people, like the likes of Plato and Aristotle, Spinoza, and Hannah Arendt, that I should have put in there now, can actually be shown by brains. Anyway, so so in my sort of normal life I teach, and then a bit of feedback. So also, if you think that I am being completely outrageous, do heckle me. So I mean, they can see you nodding down there, so I now expect you to sort of say, objection, Your Honour, or whatever, if you're a lawyer, or just say, oh, come on. Anything like that is positive. Anyway, so we have bits of the brain that I will, that are sort of quite useful to know. As a general rule, I mean, you can see parts of it here, there are, I mean, or maybe I should just sort of show in my own head. So there are three areas of the brain that I find interesting, and there are differences between conservatives and liberal brains. One of the things that is absolutely, in my opinion, very fascinating, but I am a nerd, is that you can, with 85% certainty, show if you are a conservative or if you are what the Americans call a liberal by using a brain scan. And you're skeptical there. That's fine. That's good. That's good. And how can you do that? Because there are parts of the brain that light up when different people see different things. For example, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, these are wonderfully long words, and you feel very important that you can say dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and I've trained that for a long time, is decision making, and is sort of up here. So people who are by and large conservative tend to sort of use that part of the brain which is also to do with inhibition. So if you are sort of presented with a thing that is new and you don't understand, then, and I'm slightly, what's that word, simplifying it a bit, but by and large, people who are conservative are people who are a bit skeptical of new things. So they would be skeptical of policies, and basically being conservative is about being sort of like, well, conservative. So the part of the brain that normally lights up there is that. Then we got the insula, which is sort of like on the side and under the laps there. And people who normally show a lot of empathy and sort of like, I feel your pain and feel quite sorry for people, that tends to be associated with an activation of that part of the brain. Again, these are simplifications. It's not quite as simple as that, but up to a point it is. Then we have, deep in the brain, we have a part of the brain that's called the amygdala. Amygdala means almond in Latin, because it has a vague shape of an almond. Actually, I can't really see that, but that's what it's supposed to be. The amygdala, which you can see here, is a part of the brain that we've had, well, actually for millions of years. We share that with rats, cats, and bats, and that even rhymes. And it's not sort of a super sophisticated part of the brain. So far, so good. And again, this is for you, it will be sort of like, come on, you can do better than that. But I mean, also for the other people, please give me a break, okay? Right, because we're being pedagogical here. And of course, there is all the footnotes that comes with that. No, it's good, you can, because I'm just giving you, just sort of like, being defensive already here. But that's, and also pedagogically, I think we need to get into it. Now, so those three parts of the brain are the ones that are, if you like, of interest for the present purposes. And if you want to have more details, you can buy the book, which is available on Amazon for a reasonable price. Actually, I think it's not reasonable price, but I can't argue with that. I don't do the sales, and that wasn't a very good sales pitch. You can see why I'm doing philosophy and not working in Silicon Valley. My brother always says to me, why do you do that job? You don't get paid very well. And then I say, no, but I'm very clever. And he says, I'm not sure. Anyway, that's a family argument. Right, so just dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, skepticism by and large, and it's oversimplifying, and insular is empathy. So people who are conservatives are people who are sort of skeptical. People who are on the left are people who probably are more sort of into social justice, if you like. Again, that's oversimplification. Now, how do we know that? There is a thing called the implicit association test, where people, and now the people are nodding, and if you've done the test yourself, then you realize that you're actually quite not as nice a person as you thought you were. And I have done that, and I was horrified, and my children did it, and they were horrified when they saw that. They done the test themselves, and then they were horrified too. So people by and large, when they do that test, can sort of show if they're on the left or on the right and what views they really have. And then you can control that by showing the brain scans, and you can see the people who have more liberal dispositions have more the empathy part of the brain, and then the more conservatives one have the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Where does that leave the amygdala, this sort of fear and fright part of the brain, the cats, rats, and bats part of the brain? What is interesting is that if you do brain scans, as I've been involved in, with people who are very, very sort of, if for want of a better word, Trumpian, and I see a grimace down here. I mean, I'm assuming you're not voting for that individual. I probably wouldn't either, but I'm not giving a vote. So people who support Donald Trump, when they see photos of Mexicans and people they don't like or hear statements, they don't activate the insula. Actually, maybe you should, because these are poor people who are trying to make a better life. Nor are they showing the sort of like, I'm a bit skeptical, and some of them are doing that. They actually show the same reaction in the brain as if they see a rattlesnake coming towards them, which is not helpful if we're trying to have a proper political debate. So that part of the amygdala, the fear and fright part of the brain, has an interesting social history or sociological history. Now I'm probably asking mainly the women in the room if they know Colin Firth. Some women are nodding. Yes. You're not nodding. You don't know. He's before your generation. He was sort of like, he jumped into a lake and jumped up, and his shirt was sort of, clinging to it. You remember that, don't you? Yes, you do. Yes, and that had changed your life. And Colin Firth is this sort of like guy, I don't like him, a lot of women like him. It's a bit like David Beckham. I don't like David Beckham, but then again, my wife doesn't like Selma Hayek for the same reason. Such is families. So anyway, so Colin Firth is not just a guy who jumps into a lake and gets out with his wet t-shirt on. He's also quite a political guy. And in England, we have a show called the Today Programme. It's like the news programme in the morning. And every now and then, famous people will then do the Today Programme. So they get all the journalists and they can do lots of different things. And Colin Firth was very concerned, and this is around 2010, where there weren't that many people who were sort of very far right-wing. So he was very concerned about this development that people had into sort of anger politics and very diverse diversify, sort of diverse opinions and very polarized opinions. So when he was guest editing the Today program, he says, could we get some brain scientists to look at that brain? And the people in the Today program were a bit sort of like, yeah, well, why do you want to do that? He said, well, I want to see what happens in the brain when people do all this sort of stuff, which was a genius move, really. I mean, I probably hate him even more now, because if he'd just been like Don Went was good in a T-shirt and all of that, that would be one thing, but he actually came up with things. So he got some people at UCL, University College London, where, as it happens, where I started my political science career, got them to do brain scans of young conservatives in Britain. And young conservatives in Britain weren't sort of old-fashioned, we should take it very easy, we should not rock the boat type of person. They turned out to have very highly activated amygdalas. So what happened subsequently to that was that Colin Firth and the researchers at UCL published a research paper, and this research paper is now co-written by Colin Firth. So Colin Firth is a published brain scientist. Which is pretty good in addition to the wet T-shirt, I think you would say. But you're not commenting. Anyway, right. So this is, in a way, just the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. We'll sort of skip over that one because we have already looked at that. Now, this is when we get back to the kind of where we're from. And you're trying to read this. Plato is the guy's name, or Platon, as he is called in Greek. Now, what I found interesting, my dad was a Latin teacher, by the way, I should say this by way of introduction. So our holidays were with me on a sort of a tandem bike, my dad riding it, me sitting in the back, and then him going through various Greek words that he thought I had to understand. That is a different upbringing, so we didn't really do TikTok back in the day. I'm sure that would be a TikTok thing on classical Greek. But one of the things that Plato wrote in a great book called Politeia, which is often translated as the Republic, is he writes about many things. He has got wonderful insights like anything learned under compulsion is never remembered, which is a pretty good line. And maybe that's why I don't really understand much Greek anyway, be that as it may. Plato in the Republic was very interested in the things that happen when a democracy breaks down. And if you ever pick up a copy of the Republic, and you read the 8th and the 9th chapter, it is almost, and maybe I'm just saying this because I'm a nerd, but it's almost as if you're reading about things today. And I'll just say what he has to say about this, because that's where, and then we'll try to get the brain stuff into it. Now, he talks about a situation where lots of people feel they're undervalued. We have a democracy, everybody's allowed to speak, everybody's allowed to take part in a democracy. Plato is often seen as an anti-democrat. I think it's a vast simplification. If you read his letters, he's really quite positive towards democracy, but that's a different story. There could be hecklers now here who says, well, actually he says in the 7th letter, and I know all these sort of things, but I think there's a credible argument here. Anyway, he talks about democracy being the most beautiful system because it is, quote, like a dress with many colors, which is quite a nice, so we have different sort of threads running through the dress. And he says, in a democracy, you typically have lots of people who feel, especially when things are going, sort of downhill economically, they feel they're not being listened to. And these people, he goes on in the Republic, they will then find a champion whom they will elevate to greatness. This champion will typically be the son of a very rich man. You can now start seeing the contours of who it might be. Yeah, okay, blonde hair kind of person. And then, once they've given power to this individual, who will, and I'm paraphrasing, do lots of favors for his friends, not do lots of things for the people, then the people will realize suddenly that he's become a tyrant. And Plato goes on to say, that is going from the frying pan into the fire. You all know that saying, from the frying pan into the fire, and every time you say that, you are quoting Plato. So that's just, just in the future, you'll say, like Plato said, from the frying pan into the fire. Now, that is sort of like, I think Plato basically, great man that he was, predicted people like Donald Trump, not because Donald Trump is a particular individual who's particularly nasty. I'm not a great fan of the man, and I appreciate that there could be people who are, but then I'm happy to have a debate about policy. But throughout the ages, whenever you look at how democracies break down, it's pretty much always that people get very angry, then they find a champion who claims to speak on behalf of the people, and that individual then becomes a tyrant, and suddenly people are worse off, and they've gone from the frying pan into the fire. Now, what is interesting about Plato, and this is where the neuroscience comes into it, he says our soul is like a chariot, a man sort of steering a chariot, and he's got two horses. One horse is the one that has sort of desire and food and hunger, and the other one is the spirited one, and that's called thymos in Greek. And thymos is this sort of feeling of rage where he's like, I'm very angry because you are not treating me well. And it's okay to have an element of that sort of like, I get very angry. But my argument is that the thymos part of the brain is really just the amygdala part of the brain. And it's good to have anger, but we cannot just have anger. And Plato goes on at great length to say, what we really should have in the soul is we should have a balance between the three, like of desires, of food and hungry. We should have the reasonable part, or nous or logistikon in Greek. And we should have the angry part, but they should all be balanced. There's a guy called Sigmund Freud who became rather successful later in life. Somebody is nodding down there, yeah, okay, no, maybe, it's a bit like sort of like the auctions, like yes, going, gone. Yes, and Sigmund Freud talked about the divine Plato, who had this tripartite part of the soul. So in some ways, Sigmund Freud was inspired by Plato too, but Sigmund Freud was psychology 120 years ago. I'm trying to be a bit more psychology nowadays. So my argument then is that that in some ways have already put Plato in the brain scanner, and there are correlations between, so things that we can see through neuroscience, things we can, when we analyze how people get angry because of political things, that basically comes up with the same argument as we have from Plato. In other words, Plato may not have been in the brain scanner or under the brain scanner, whatever the correct phrasing is, but Plato's ideas basically chime with those of neuroscience. So we've got sort of the two things. Just on Plato, because I know it's always good to have a little bit of entertainment in between, or maybe not, but anyway, he's going to get it anyway because I get to talk right now. Plato's real name was not Plato. His name was Aristocratus. Arista comes from good. It's like aristocrat is somebody who's a good rule, it actually means. So Aristocratus was a young man, and he read poetry, and he'd also, yes, the guy, there's somebody who knows. Oh, I love it when I'm being anticipated. I was about to ask you, but that's a bit sort of too much student interaction. But you did this when you said Plato. And Plato means the broad-shouldered one, or the broad one. Now, why would he have that name? Because Plato's first career, you're nodding there, because you know that he was a wrestler. Yes, he was a wrestler. He actually won the Isthmian Games, which is pretty decent. He was a decent wrestler. And in pretty much every single one of the dialogues, he refers to wrestling. And it's not like, philosophy is not like wrestling, which you can train if you have a good coach. And he goes on to things like that. So Plato was his wrestling name. So if 2,000 years from now, The Rock, or whoever is the greatest wrestler at the moment, becomes a philosopher, we will say that did you know that the Rock's real name was Dwayne Johnson? Oh, really? Was it? Right, okay. But I think that's unlikely. I think it's unlikely. So we will move on. So, right, so in a way I've already sort of skipped ahead of myself. We have the amygdala there in the brain, and I will now basically say this again. And I can send you the presentation, by the way, instead of you. Yeah, but I mean, we cater for all that we in here, so people can have the presentation afterwards, I think. Yes. So the thymus is basically, and again, I am vastly simplifying this. The thymus is basically the amygdala in the so-called limbic system. Right, so far, so good. Now, Plato, of course, had a student, and he was called Aristotle. And Aristotle, I got in trouble, by the way, a couple of years ago, because I was writing a thing for a Greek newspaper. They asked me to write a piece on Aristotle and democracy and so on, and I referred to him as Macedonian, and he was, by his own admission, a Macedonian, but that wasn't very popular in Greece. And they said, we have to have it as a Greek. And I said, no, but he was Macedonian, and he was known as Aristotle the Macedon. So it's not as if it's sort of like secret. He was Greek, and he spoke Greek, and I'm sure, but still, anyway. So I hope there are no Greek people here. I'm hurting unnecessarily. All Macedonians who will be very proud of having such a great man among them. So Aristotle here got the best picture in the world, and he of course wrote the Nicomachean Ethics, not for his dad but for his son. They didn't have ideologies really back in the day, And Aristotle is also a bit of a complex individual when we sort of look at it. But the main thing I would say, and this is this word bouloisis, which is difficult to translate directly, which is the problem. I don't know if any of you are sort of like into languages. The problem with languages is that you never translate them one-to-one. You sort of say, well, what does that word mean? Yeah, well, it means that, but it also kind of means that. So in a way, we're sort of lost in translation here. And bouloisis is basically a word for deliberation. But deliberation sounds a bit sort of, I don't know, I find it's a bit sort of management speak. Well, deliberate over that or so on. So it's basically a word for what we get to once we are sort of debating and open to each other and listening to each other. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, which is sort of the second compendium to he says it's a treatise in political science. You need to be ethical before you become political. Now that's a thought, isn't it? To have ideas about what is good and bad before you can start dealing with political science. Anyway, that's what Aristotle meant. And he wasn't necessarily ethical himself, but anyway, so he talks about this bouloisis. Now, what is interesting about this, and he talks about listening. We'll come back to listening in a second, because this is the politics of listening is what I'm talking about here. And he then uses the example of the boule, which is the assembly that the Greeks had. Now, Greek democracy is, I don't know how much you know, but we all know that the Greeks had a kind of democracy, just only men, which is kind of like a bit of a problem. Plato, by the way, in one of his, in the Republic, or Politeia, has a line where he says, you don't expect women always just to be better than men, do you? And he turns it that way around, which is quite interesting. And he says, well, all the things that are relevant for political things, men could be just as good as women, again, that way around. Aristotle doesn't quite see it like that. We know from other things that his wife was a bit of a forceful personality, and maybe that had clouded his argument. But anyway, the boule was their assembly. So in Greece, everybody could vote, and then 500 men were chosen at random, so in a lottery, to be part of the boule, and they would then be doing most of the work sort of between sessions, and then there would be a committee of 10 of the 500 from each of the dime, which is parts of Athens at the time, who would then be presiding over, rubbish collection and other important aspects of running the state. But the boule was the place where people would listen to each other, and he goes on at great length about this idea about listening. So when I was I'm interested in Aristotle because I think he was a very interesting person. I'm interested in Plato for the same reason. But I always sort of thought that's really quite profound that he had that thing about listening. And I'll just move to the next one. Actually, just on the listen, I'll just go back to that. I don't know how many of you are sometimes sitting through meetings where people just don't listen to what you have to say. I don't know. Every week, it's my life. You're looking as if you've never heard that before. Maybe your life is different than mine, and maybe your colleagues are just nicer. And I remember just when we had all these endless Zoom meetings, and one of my colleagues, who shall not be named here because this is going out and being recorded for YouTube later, and she might know who it is when I'm saying this example, was quite forceful and telling me all the things I didn't know. And then I said, NN, that's their name, I'm happy for you to win the argument, but can we please try to solve the problem? And the person looked at me and says, if you say that I win the argument, then I won. I said, yeah. Because, frankly, I couldn't care less about this meeting. I have important things to do, like writing books, and I wasn't particularly interested in the exam board of that year. And I was happy for them to just decide that procedural matter was being like that. And then the person said afterwards, from now on, I will try to also solve the issue and maybe just listen to people. But I do want to have my way, but maybe we could also solve the problem. And I sort of thought, well, that's a novel idea. And it then became sort of actually quite for want of a better word, a philosophical debate, because my colleague and I then suddenly sat down, and we'd never been enormously great fans of one another, because she thought I was pompous and Oxford and all the rest of it, and I thought she was from Wales and being arrogant because of that. There's nothing wrong with being from Wales, but if you just find people sort of difficult to, and this person will now know who she is. Anyway, because we became quite sort of pally over this, because we realized we could actually solve a problem together. And my colleague, who's not necessarily a political philosopher, but a well-read individual, said, isn't that a bit like democracy overall? Because democracy overall has this wonderful thing about it being that we learn from our mistakes. And the person then quoted Karl Popper, who is a philosopher I don't particularly like because he's very critical of Plato and I don't like his analysis. See, that's just me winning the argument there. But anyway, the argument in somebody like Karl Popper, whom I'm not a great fan of, is that you learn by mistakes. We do something and then actually we are being corrected when we learn. And my colleague, who also knows Chinese philosophy, of which I know absolutely nothing whatsoever, which is, I know that's a problem and I should have read other people from other cultures, but you can't do everything. But there is a saying in Chinese, which is, 3 stupid shoemakers know more than Confucius. And it's, okay, maybe they're shoemakers who say we're not stupid, we're very intelligent people. Yeah, okay, fine. Well, 3 shoemakers then. And China is not necessarily a country that's known for its long and deeply rooted democratic traditions. But that particular saying in Chinese is actually pretty identical to a thing that that Hannah Arendt, who, in my opinion, one of the greatest philosophers ever, that's kind of like banal to say nowadays, but I think she is. And she talked about how political things are basically sort of solved in a ping pong, where we're not just, it's not just that I am very clever and I know all these things, but I sort of get corrected. And in many ways it is through this process where we all together actually learn more than Confucius. So the three stupid shoemakers actually may know more than that. So when Aristotle is talking about the art of listening, then it's not just that he's talking about the art of listening, but there's also a reason for that, because when people get together, we're able to correct our mistakes. Right, so these sort of brain scanny things are sort of in a way just by illustration, and I will then go into why they are so interesting. Now, if we are involved in discussions of more complicated matters, if we actually listen to people, and if we are engaged in, well, maybe I should start in a different place, which is what my book does. Sorry, that's a bit, I'm a naughty professor, I'm allowed to be a little bit sort of all over the place. Yeah. Okay, you say that, okay, at least good, good, at least I have one friend. Anyway, so I don't know if you've ever, actually I always said to my students I'll only quote 5 different people, and I've already exceeded my quota considerably. But there is a German thinker called Carl Schmitt. Have you ever heard of Carl Schmitt? Yeah, he's not a nice guy, is he? No, but he's very clever, though. And Carl Schmitt was a German lawyer who wrote a book called The Political Theology, which is, where he says the martial law is when, he sort of talks about that. And Carl Schmitt, biographically joined the Nazi Party, which I normally hold against people. So did Heidegger, and lots of people probably did that, but I do not particularly like that particular thing. However, Carl Schmitt, notwithstanding his political affiliations, was a very bright guy, and he said, if we try, he has a book called Das Begriff des Politischen, so the concept of the political. He says, what is politics? And he says, politics is a thing we have to define through juxtapositions. And he says, aesthetics is the sphere where we distinguish between ugly and beautiful. So far, so good, no argument. Ethics is where we're dealing with good and bad. Economics is when we're dealing with profitable and non-profitable. So far, so good, not so very controversial. And then he goes on with great sort of furore and says, and politics is a sphere where we distinguish between friend and enemy. And in any political science introductory class, you read Carl Schmitt and you say that's the friend and enemy distinction. And politics is where we're distinguishing between friend and enemy. Now, so far, so depressing, because if politics is friend and enemy, then there is absolutely no way that when we are traveling to Texas and other places, or I'm traveling to Texas and I meet people who don't like people that I'm sort of, there's no way the twain shall ever meet. If politics is only friend and enemy, then it is the politics of I win the argument and you just shut up and then I get my way, which is extremely far removed from the Hannah Arendt and the Aristotle, and let's try to solve the problem together and lies and listen and so on. However, I think there is a way back. And that way back is in English. We uniquely, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, uniquely we have a distinction between politics and policy. A policy is a thing where we're trying to solve the problem. And I think if I were to talk to Carl Schmitt and he were to listen to me, the instructive word there, I would say, well, that's true Dr. Schmidt, I would be deferential to him because he would probably like to be called doctor, him being German and all. I would say, you're right, Dr. Schmidt. Aesthetics is ugly and beautiful, and ethics is good and bad, and politics is a friend and enemy, but policy is feasible and not feasible. So whenever I've tried to talk to people from political persuasions that are different from mine, I always start by saying to them, look, what is the problem we're trying to solve? I mean, never mind if you say, oh, there are too many Mexicans coming in. They wouldn't say it in that accent, by the way. There would be people who say, in English, there are too many people coming over the channel. And I don't know if you have to have a Cockney accent for having that view, but you often do. And people say, yeah, but we can't go on like this because they're coming in and they want to take my country. And then, and probably when this goes out on YouTube, I'll be stoned. And however, and then I'm sort of saying, because, obviously there is a limit to that, but I would then typically in the argument say, and there are also people who say, well, we could just take everybody in, and what's the problem, and we can just take this. And basically, both of those arguments are just like, I want as much immigration as possible, I want no immigration. That's just on a continuum. It's going to be where on this line do we draw, but where would be a reasonable compromise, and why? What is the problem we're trying to solve? Now, if you then have people who discuss politics, and you put them in the brain scanner, and then they will either have the conservative or the liberal or the radical part of the brain. That's very few parts of the brain that get activated when people are presented with politics views. When I was in Australia last year as a visiting professor, I was working with people. I said, well, let's see what happens if you try to solve a policy problem, such as what should the level of pensions be, which is not exactly the thing that would set your pulse racing, or like Colin Firth and all of that stuff. But it is an important issue. And then people who are discussing policies and are talking to each other will have to have a number of parts of the brain activated. For starters, the listening part and the talking parts of the brain, but also in order to solve a political problem, as some of these scans that weren't from this particular one, but they're similar results show, is that you would have to have an element of empathy, saying, well, yeah, but if we do this, there are actually people who will be worse off. Can you not feel that they might be suffering? And also, there will also be a natural element of conservatism, like, let's just calm down. Are we sure this is going to work? And there might even be a spiritedness. So many parts of the brain get activated when we're discussing policy. So when we're solving, so there's a distinction between solving problems and winning arguments. And that actually is reflected in the brain. Now, this guy is René Descartes. That was the guy I was trying to mention, but I can't. What do we call him? Descartes or Descartes? Descartes. Yes, we stick to the French name. He was French, after all, which is important. He wrote a lot about medicine, and he wrote about law, and he was sort of all over the place, a little bit like me. He was just slightly more talented. And his Discourse and Method was actually the book that he only spent like 3 weeks writing, and that's the one we remember. He was very much into his geometry. We have Cartesian coordinates, and a clever fellow. Also, René Descartes, I'm just giving these anecdotes, but I find it quite fascinating that these guys also had real lives. And the thing about Descartes was that Descartes was 5'2", so he was even shorter than me. Thomas Hobbes, by the way, was 6'2", which in the 16th century was pretty big. They didn't like each other, and they met each other, and I sort of feel that Thomas Hobbes would have been this towering figure, so little René, what then? And he might have won the argument on that account, or he might not, because René Descartes' very first book was called On Fencing, as in, sort of sword fencing. And he lived in the Netherlands most of his life, because the Netherlands was a place where they had toleration. All these, so many things were invented in the Netherlands because it was the place where they were willing to listen to people. When in England people talk about the English values or British values, the British values that we talk about, human rights and so on, are imported Dutch values. They came over when the Dutch invaded, in a humanitarian intervention, a failed state called Britain in 1688, and then we got all these Dutch values and even got a Dutch king. Anyway, René Descartes lived in the Netherlands, and he could understand Dutch, of course, he lived there. So when he was traveling on the Rhine one day, there were then some thugs who were saying, well, there's that little guy over there and his valet, I think he's a rich guy, let's just get all his money. And then they attack him, and Descartes jumps up, and then en garde in a sort of like, and you can see he even looks a bit like one of the musketeers, doesn't he? And he fights them off, and they jump into the river, and he stands vindicated. But that has got absolutely nothing to do with brain science, but sometimes maybe you need to fight them off, and maybe his amygdala was then getting activated at that time. That's good occasionally if you are on the Rhine and you're a good swordsman and you're being attacked. That's helpful, not saying that. But one of the things he says in his discourse on method, or discours de la méthode, is that there are no people who are so stupid they can't string two words together. I'm paraphrasing that now, and by the way, in French, it obviously sounds much better. And Descartes, who was interested in medicine and so on, also was on to a point. I mean, he basically, if he had lived today, he would have realized one of the things that is very interesting about the human brain. Now I'm going back briefly in the brain science thing again, and is, you know, in any science there's always the homo economicus, which is we're just human, we're just economic beings, we're so much, we're all of these things. If anything defines the thing about being human, it is the ability to learn by listening. So, you know, chimpanzees and all these other ones are wonderful beings, and they can be quite clever. They can also be incredibly vicious. There are wars between chimpanzees, and they have ethnic cleansing. And some of the types of monkeys kill each other in a genocidal sort of way. The fact that they are often in Rwanda is almost a tragic thing. So here, and when you look at when you get the slides, you can see that. But the thing about human beings, according to zoologists and paleozoologists who look at all kind of skeletons and things that we have from the past, is that we alone among all species have developed the ability to learn by listening. The reason why we got a break from the Neanderthals is that the Neanderthals were bigger than us. They had slightly bigger brains than we have. They just didn't have in their brain the ability to learn by listening. So the reason we have sort of gotten ahead in the game, I would argue, is because we have the ability to listen. We are a listening species. And that ability to listen then goes back to, again, our friend Aristotle and Hippolytus and Boulais, the ability to actually learn by that. And it goes again forward to the fact that we learn by exchanging views, we learn by listening. Now, this is again coming back to Aristotle. So, well, if I can just sort of slightly jump ahead, you've already seen these sort of T-shirts where we have the monkey, and then it goes up, and in the end, there's a guy who's walking like this. And now I think that if we are not careful, we're going to have all these people going up here, and then we have the very angry person going down again. Or maybe we're going to sort of like, Michael Jackson style, I can't quite do the moonwalk now, but we're going to go backwards in evolution. We're going to go backwards to not being thinking in the way we could. That our brain has the capacity to listen. We are hardwired in a way to be a policy species rather than being a politics species. We're hard, of course we have the ability to be angry, that's fine, but it has to be put in its place. Our main thing should be that we have the ability to listen. And when if you ever pick up Aristotle's book, The Politics. By the way, the Politics is also called Politeia. Whenever you have, when people are reading Plato, they say, oh, the Republic. The Republic is actually called the same thing as Aristotle's Politics, which is actually means more like constitution, really. But the overall thing is that they say when in the Politics by Aristotle, he then again goes back to this idea about listening, and he says it's basically when people are coming together. He talks about people sort of collectively paying for a meal, and we're sort of all getting together, and then it's better even than one person bringing all the food. We bring different kinds of food. I mean, the Greeks always like their parties, which I think is quite sweet. A symposium, which of course you know, is basically a party with, a discussion with drinking. And the fact that they had a word for discussion with drinking as opposed to just discussion, I think is quite neat. But maybe that's just because I'm too much of that personality myself. But anyway, so the Greeks had this idea that you go together and we bring things into discussion, and the multitude becomes then, and he says, like a single person, because our joint knowledge is greater than the sum of its parts. We listen to different things, and then suddenly we find a solution, but it requires that we go into that in a listening sort of way. And again, these are things just when people are listening to that. So I think, I'm probably coming towards the end of my allocated time, I think, and I will just skip through quickly. This is a bit of sort of Latin, animus sanus in corpore sano, which is a brand of training shoes, I think Asics, which is also known as that. And what is interesting is I got from my good colleague Jacob Hovey, who wrote the blurb to my book, who's a philosopher as well as a neuroscientist. He says what is interesting about a lot of this work is that when people deliberate, when people do things in a sort of engaging sort of way, they also develop what is known as their neuroplasticity. Basically, you sort of keep the mind active. So if people only use one part of the brain, then research shows that if they then get Alzheimer's or Parkinson later on, then it's really sad, they won't be able to do much. But a lot of people who actually get the physical, like who actually have Parkinson and actually it was supposed to not really be functioning, can suddenly, some people are able to work notwithstanding. And the brain, again simplifying vastly, is a bit like a park with many paths. And if you keep the paths open, then there will be perhaps a slower way, but you can sort of bypass your Parkinsonism or your Alzheimerism if you keep all these other paths open, which is one of the reasons that you have to learn Chinese when you're 80 and learn to play the saxophone when you're 90, just to keep all the pathways open. Now, another thing, this is my friend Jacob, my colleague Jacob, I should say. I think he actually took over from Peter Singer at Monash University, so there's a bit of a connection here. But he was saying to me, look, if you're engaged in policy discussion where you're using all these parts of the brain, then actually that will develop your neuroplasticity. So if you're engaged in policy discussion, if you're engaged in solving problems, then you are not only likely to have a better society, the body politic will be healthier if we discuss things, but also your own individual body will be healthy. In other words, all good things go together. Right, and I think I'm now coming towards the end of this. This is John Stuart Mill, who also talked about that. It's just for patriotic reasons. I had to have an English person there, so we'll just skip over him. But he's basically the same thing as Aristotle, and so we'll leave him be because we're out of time. Now, this woman is Mary Catherine Bateson. You might have be aware of her dad, who was also a great anthropologist, who Gregory Bateson, who wrote Steps Towards an Ecology of Mind, which is a very wonderful title. because I don't really understand what it means, but it sounds good, Steps Towards an Ecology of Mind. And in that book, he talks about the theories being the maps, not the landscape, and wonderful things like that. But in many ways, his daughter, who spoke, I think, 10 different languages, and so I have reason to hate her in the same way as Colin Firth, because, you know, these overachievers make me feel small. But she, in fact, what characterized her as a researcher was that she was always open to everything. And her strapline was, we are not what we know, but what we are willing to learn. And I think, basically, that is the thing that we all should be. I think we are hardwired. We're the only species that have the capacity to learn by listening. And by listening to other people, we become vastly cleverer than we already are. And that goes back to the Boulais. So if we look at sort of like, you know, a healthy brain is one that listens, is one that gets activated. And I don't know why I haven't got the brackets at the end. That's my fault, by the way. I hate that when I make typos, and I do it all the time. So if I can then sort of end up talking, I know I've vastly overdone my quota here. So what does all this mean? A lot of people say, right, okay, and you talked a lot now. I haven't listened, of course, which I'll shortly be doing. So what does it all mean? How does that change your life? What the so what question? And what I think it actually means is that from now on, when we meet people, I've sort of made, I mean, it sounds really hippie now, I'm sorry if I'm sounding sort of sanctimonious, but what I try to do, and I fail to do all the time, by the way, is whenever I talk to somebody, I try to say, okay, what is the thing that you're going to teach me? So if I met Donald Trump today, which is unlikely because we don't really move in the same circles, I will sit him down and say, Donald, what can you teach me? Tell me something I don't know. You know, I'll do this. Yeah. And then he would sort of sit down, you know, what I'm telling you is the art of the deal. And then it might be that Donald Trump knows something about how to close a deal. It might be good for me to know. And if I start treating Donald Trump as somebody who could potentially teach me something, I don't know what it is, but something. And if you start by always, whenever you, like I have a cousin of mine who is a member of UKIP and was elected to that. And that's a rather different political standpoint than mine. And then when I met him after this, I said, well, so what's your big idea at the moment? I said, just teach me something I don't know. What's the thing that would really enlighten me? And then he's sort of like, are we not going to talk about how you hate my politics? I said, no. And he's almost sort of like, oh, come on, I was spoiling for a fight. And I said, yeah, but let's just try to, you know, what's the thing that you think, what's the thing that you'd really teach me, like a factual thing that would be, or an insight or something. And then people sort of start sort of thinking, well, now I'm being treated, now he's respecting me, he's actually listening to me. And then typically what happens in the discussions is that people say, and they start sort of, you know, rationally explaining what they think, and it calms the temperature down. And suddenly we're in the situation where we are not what we know, but what we're willing to learn. And I think we have a brain that is evolved for us to sit down and say, what are you actually going to teach me? So soon I will be learning lots from you, and maybe, just maybe, you might have learned one or two things from me. Thank you for inviting me here. It was great pleasure.